Hello everyone, question and answer video today. You know that I don't make so many of these because I leave more space to the doctrine that of course demands our undivided attention for most of the time. Actually, today I will answer two atypical questions. One has been cancelled, it's been deleted from the video about Napoleon, and I don't think there is anything wrong actually in fishing it back because it was interesting. Let's say there were some things maybe the author said, okay, there's a long date follower that has produced actually some of the most beautiful videos I've ever made from the Serene playlist due to his reflections on, mostly it was von Clausewitz at the beginning. Now we started talking about the Anglo-Saxon exception, like in historical, cultural, and moral sense. This referred to essentially the empirical character that I attributed at least then. It's something that was discussed also on Reddit at some point about my channel, and that I haven't responded to, which was in this case related to the video I made about the Code of Napoleon. Alright, so the double value of modernity and tradition, like the third estate revolutions, and what did this mean, like in the history of mankind? How do we, transcend the same cases, and what these Western cultures within its internal differences contribute, in fact, to that crucial time of booming, by the way. And it was a very interesting question. I just noticed right now today I plan to answer this question, and I was just sitting a couple of minutes ago before starting the video saying, now I have it there, I will read it. Instead I see it's deleted, so it's not a problem. The author has my full sympathy. I have nothing. Actually, it was a very interesting and well written as well. So maybe we'll manage to fish it back. And this is also for those who say that I nobody ever said this, but you may think that I ignore like the difficult questions, or I don't even publish them or something like that. Definitely there is this fair share of censorship on Schwerpunkt, but never for intelligent questions. Doesn't matter how sort of not in this case, but also antagonistic they can be. That's mostly actually an issue that was pointed out. Was not pointed out, but say on the Reddit discussion. If you remember that, I haven't read the page anymore. Actually, we could go fish for further, fresh, issues. Let's put it in this way. Soon, but the idea of how does Schwerpunkt address ideological issues? What's the channel about overall? What kind of beliefs are attached to the channel? How far does his thought go? And as far as that conversation was concerned, if you remember about it, I think that the point is clear. Make it often on the channel. I generally doubt that, and also because of my fault, admittedly, because I'm very hermetic, right, sort of very cryptic sometimes about the whole thing, because it's not meant to be that open. It is meant to be partly occult, right, and to be revealed over time, and we still have to make so much work before even setting the sort of the spiritual standards right on this channel, and it's a very, very hard work. It requires a massive, preparation in order to provide with that kind of initiation. And I'm serious about it. I'm just a medium of this. I'm not really the inventor of it. But so that generally speaking, people may know, it's not something you can simply find out there. So I will be clear about this. In part, we will address the topic by answering this question that is mostly unrelated, telling you the truth. The other one, which I actually want to answer earlier, is very short, this is from a new follower that has made interesting points. It's one of the few ones that I said, well, I will allow actually this sort of criticism because it is intelligent, right? Even in its simplicity, because the question goes as far as saying it's not even a question. It's it was a statement. I don't remember. Let me check because this one should be easy to find. God, where is it? Well, I will find that. In any case, yes, because this is not part of the channel. Excuse me. Now we'll find it again. It was just a statement. I have to remember which video because it made a lot of sense. Came from regarding the Romanity of the empire in the West, and the issue that I was presenting in that particular video. And really God knows where this was. It was just like a couple of weeks ago. Can't find it. But literally, it was not, again, even a question. It was just saying the empire was Roman all along. It's actually a beautiful theme because, as you know, I'm actually and let's simply get into it. Actually very much a proponent, as you know, of the idea that throughout the early Middle Ages, and this video may have been exactly, yes, this was the one about the Ottonians. I'm pretty sure about the Ottonian. It had something to do with the Franks or with the Ottonians, because that's when the thing really happened, but it was talking specifically of the Ottonians. En passant, the interesting thing is that and again, I can't find it. It doesn't matter. I just wanted to know which video it was, but it's not an issue. I'm very much a proponent of the fact that truly the Roman Empire was alive, not just in the form of the so-called Byzantine Empire. Yesterday we had a word or two regarding why I happily use the term Byzantine without many issues, actually. In the metaphysical and spiritual condition of the world followed to the temporary representation of the golden age as it had under Augustus, as it had been prophesied by basically all the peoples that we're aware of regarding the partitioning eras, like popping up once again between the third and fourth and last age, that is the Bronze and the Iron one. This naturally, in a Christian sense, was seen as very providentially, to say the least. Think about Virgil, the Phoebus Apollo that was sung by the classical author, celebrating that particular Augustan affirmation as, of course, the birth of Christ. So we will not digress on this and all the ecumenic implications, the truly Catholic implications that the Roman Empire meant in essence. That I circle around the topic very often just with these hints at the thing. There are some videos in which I dealt with the Catholic identity of the Catholic condition. This is the actual point. Like, Catholicism is a condition. It's not a non-negotiable one. It's not a matter of Christian confessions or whatever. It's literally what was believed, like also before Christianity. Of course, took that specific role in the process. And the question is very interesting because it was referred to a phrase that, even if the author of the comment did not point, I immediately, of course, recognized, in which I was hinting at the fact that up to a certain point, especially around the reign of Otto III, even after Charlemagne's crowning on Christmas of 800, the Romanity of that empire, now we'll explain exactly what we mean, because terms are crucial here, was actually not accepted within the same Frankish and later Saxon world, at least in the sense that it would eventually acquire and maintain, in fact, from the late Ottonian era and until the existence of, in fact, of the Holy Roman Empire until Napoleon. So the reason why I made that remark is the following. I made some videos, and there is one properly called From the Imperium Francorum to the Imperium Romanum Christianum that explains this. It was from some year ago. It's a bit more of a primitive video. Then there is another one, if I'm not wrong, the one on the Byzantine influence on the Germanic, say, imperial theory. Something that was based on Otto III mostly, but also made others from the Renovatio Imperii playlist that explained, and actually in a very random way, just today, that the cycle provided us with further stuff, especially about the reign of Otto I, in that sense, at the time when that Romanity had not sort of ethnically been affirmed for the same Germanic rulers. And this is also crucial to understand. We will see step by step why. In fact, the main notion having remained a sort of, sometimes even ethnically undefined, but Augustan imperial power attribution to, say, I don't know, Charlemagne, to Otto I. This is particularly relevant because, as you know, the papal crowning, that was the only way that one was sanctioned starting from Louis the Pius formally and continuously until very, very late, like throughout the entire Middle Ages, practically, of the Romanity, of the crowning by the Pope, was again formally recognized. Like, Charlemagne was truly a Roman emperor, right? There was no doubt about this. The Byzantines, for example, were freaking out because they would recognize, for subtle political reasons, Charlemagne with the imperial title, which is another huge deal in itself, without saying Roman, which was a very cunning way of putting that. And we should explain why this was the case. First of all, ancestrally, it is true that, at least it is true, this is something I came up with first in general. Let's point out why I said something that may just sound eccentric compared to the same concept that is somehow eccentric. In origin, of course, the Roman Empire was thought not, first of all, to have ever fallen as such, right? Because the Golden Age had been accomplished by such a truly ecumenic degree that Romanity had been ethnically, this is incredibly important to understand, it means genetically connected with the empire, right? In other words, the empire itself had been produced in an ecumenic level by God's will in a time in which the Roman people had taken over the entirety of the world. There is no room for saying that tribe was out or in, doesn't matter. Like, Rome had conquered the literal world and universe, right? So the idea that this accomplishment had been formally, in fact, achieved, there would be lots of interesting things to discuss regarding Alexander, because there is something less, say, more clamorous about his exploit, but less definitive, as you know, also in an institutional sense. So Romanity is what, say, half of the world still displays as the symbol of its radical identity, politically and institutionally, and not just in the West, by the way, even if we don't realize it anymore, but symbols are important. And the idea is, it's as if, let's say, there could have not been any empire but true Romanity. Meaning that even if, as it happened, as you know, the Roman Empire shrank to what we call like the Byzantine Empire, and in the West, the Latins and the Germans created created, reawakened, right? This is the actual point. They reobtained by themselves the Imperium, the winged victory, the Holy Ghost, wherever you want to call it, manifesting traumatically in Charlemagne's individual power over this enormous extent. Like, this would have not, this was the problem that those same peoples had, like the Franks in this case, would have not been, say, from the Catholic standpoint, from the Roman standpoint, would have always been Roman. So in other words, there was a sort of hierarchy for which, at least transcendentally, in order to become an emperor, you had to have become Roman, because those standards had been so high that no other people had ever achieved them. And this is absolutely true, right? The collapse of the Roman Empire, or at least its dramatic shrinking, in a political territorial sense, doesn't mean that it was ever replaced historically by anything better than that, right? There was a clamorous collapse. Everybody was dragged down into it. Like, the system, say, people survived, but nobody managed to re-achieve a Roman power by any stretch of the imagination, nor the same Romans, nor the Germans, nor anybody else. But the idea is that if you were to re-elevate yourself to that standard, you could not be but being Roman. Now, the papal element in this was crucial because of the Roman spirit, let's say, in that case, the Christian paradigm having shifted, having acknowledged that the empire had collapsed, because the original idea of the unity between the lay and temporal power in the emperor, that was also the head of the Roman religion, could not be matched, because essentially of the prophesied collapse of human worth over time. The more functional way to actually try to restore that was to separate church and state, as it did happen. Like, people, again, in modernistic terms, think this nonsense that, there was a time in which, okay, up to recently, like in, say, the Middle Ages or the modern age, in which church and state were one thing. They weren't, right? The fact that there was a partnership has nothing to do with them being the same thing. That's just an incredibly asinine. That's like the ABC of history. Like, it's not just Christian history. Like, the church, the papal state, they do not belong to earth, nor to any empire, by definition, right? By Christ's word. It has nothing to do with what people think. That has never mattered in the history of mankind. What matters is how things are, right? And whether people understand it or not, which is a completely different aspect from wishing to have power, actually having it. The Roman papacy had also essentially won this spiritual game, not just by having monopolized the, say, Western and especially Latin Germanic spirituality. Always remember that Lenin said that the main obstacle for towards communism was Roman and Germanic culture. And that's how important, of course, for somebody born in the 19th century, when the sense of Romanity and Germanity of the empire was being potently revived. And we will get to that point in the second, actually, the first question we were describing. And that especially had separated itself, as we were discussing yesterday, from Byzantine autocracy. Because the Byzantine Empire was also naturally a Christian empire, but had maintained certain, say, formal, let's say, characters of Caesaropapism that entailed things like the Sebastocrator, for example. The idea that the emperor was Augustus still, and so sacred, had been, reached a level of power and control that would literally put popes to death when he could. Not often, fortunately, but that fundamentally would rule over the Patriarchate of Constantinople. And so it was something still, in part, it would actually backfire in the sense that it was true that human standards were sinking. So even if the Byzantines were very tough, they sort of lost it themselves. And so that produced, as a side effect, this sclerotization of Byzantine society was taken over eventually by the same Westerners, and later on also by the Turks, which is even worse. But let's say even worse. I mean, I'm not offending Westerners, as you know, my channel is actually making the point, as I'm actually making in this very long periods, that actually the Westerners had it, more traditional than the same Byzantines, in spite of what people tend to believe in a strictly archaic Roman traditional sense, right? And so the problem in all this is that, and so yes, the empire was always yes, of course, Christian, but also always Roman, right? The Pope would crown all the emperors, aside from what they thought, as we will see now, what their peoples thought, were always Roman emperors, right? Charlemagne was not crowned emperor of the Franks. Otto I was not crowned emperor of the Eastern Franks or the Saxons. Not to do with that. These are always Roman emperors, and there is a very clear distinction. On Schwerpunkt, we haven't dealt with some aspects of this story. For example, how did the Westerners or the Easterners of the empire was seen in the moment of the Renovatio Imperii, because there had been two administrative parts. As you know, there technically had never been two empires. Like, the empire is only one and can't be otherwise. That's why the Byzantines quite legalistically said something like, only an emperor, so our emperor, can appoint another emperor. So the idea that the Pope, first of all, the Pope could have not done it. Here, literally, the Byzantines had lost Rome in the process. Rome would really never be in anybody's papal power till to this day. And the sense being, however, that, we deny the fact that, you see even here, that the actual real vicary of Christ on earth, that the Byzantine emperors themselves had tried to sort of clothe themselves like, that is the Pope, it doesn't have, in fact, the right to do that, right? Just imagine the sort of the traditional, and I'm being very gentle in this summary to explain something terrible that actually was done against the papacy in that sense. The papacy won, anyway, in the broader struggle, and also thanks, of course, to the fact that the empire had been revived in the West, which is also something that should make you think, because the empire was not revived. I mean, of course, as we were saying before, nobody would fully restore the might of the Roman Empire, but the fact that this is just a matter of perspective, right? That the western half of the Roman Empire sort of evaporated, but that less than 300 years later, there was someone who was able to take over back again. Most of it in an exercise of functional rule, should make you think about the actual potential of these terrible dark ages that actually witnessed the even in what was the objectively slow and gradual sort of civilizational redevelopment of Latin Germanic Europe, was something clamorously potent. And even culturally wise, we should actually start realizing that the West was not particularly backwards at all compared to the East. Nor it had really ever been from at least like the affirmation of the Roman Empire. And there is something that in the indicators of this, most people think technology or, I don't know, unitary state. Study early medieval literature. Look at early medieval art. Look at the persistence of these beliefs and how, I don't know, the church operated. But when I see that my ecclesiastical history videos get less views, I sort of feel like, what the hell, like, how can you be interested in the Middle Ages and literally like thinking that ecclesiastical history is something sort of secondary to this all? Like, you literally miss the entire traditional side of the story, not because it's the church, it's because it's literally what these people were trying to revive the empire for. And when you get that, and why there was, in fact, this, the Roman spiritual preeminence in the West, that's something you should make you think also about Romanity. What is Romanity, right? That Rome was the holy city. It wasn't like something that, I don't know, somebody at some point switched the lights off and said, okay, well, now this is just a place, plenty of ruins, there's nothing to see, just look at Constantinople, or just think about, I don't know, whatever. There is, in the West, surely the Enlightenment has made us interiorize this collapse. It was a true collapse. Like, you do not need to, try to make it less than it was, but it doesn't mean that it was an eraser or a deletion or like a simple transvestment of what existed before. It is a completely modernistic, secularistic, and fundamentally anti-historical and anti-scientific, anti-moral view of looking at this specific past. Now, going back to the question, I'm sure there are a bunch of other things I would like to say, but the idea in that is, say, what the Germans thought about this all. And I have plenty of videos incoming at some point on this topic because it's extremely relevant also to the Ghibelline Middle Ages and what were those guys doing in Italy and Germany, like killing each other from day to night for centuries over. And we have to make an effort because I am convinced the more I went on studying the migration era, the more I realized that, of course, the Germans were actually not particularly endowed with that sense of Apollonianly exalted sense of greatness that the Romans themselves had done. I mean, the Romans had fully achieved that. There was much of that also among the Greeks that surely had set the standard with Alexander and the Dorian migrations, Delphius, the Omphalos of the world, and all this kind of things. Rome had just done the most consistent part of the story, but the peoples living around Rome understood very heavily this hierarchy. Now, 19th century ethno-nationalism made us believe essentially that these peoples would simply consider themselves superior to whoever lived in the Mediterranean, and that their victory over the Romans was essentially just the natural consequence of the moral weakening of the latter. This is in part true. There is no doubt that as a dynamic, this is generally valid, but it should be framed actually a much bigger one. That was the fact that first these peoples had been fundamentally aware that for centuries and more they had literally lived at the outskirts of civilization. They had actually been bred themselves into what had been the Roman Empire. I mean, literally the so-called Visigoths were created as a Roman army, like within the same empire, and set the standard for Germanic kingship that up to that point the Germans themselves had not been able to achieve as a unitary power, right? There is, aside from the fact that the Germans were perfectly fine with the idea of preserving Romanity, and because they knew that was the gold standard, right? And they did their best, objectively, even to do so, and that, of course, they were also obliged by the fact that once they settled in a permanent, realm, right, with a territorial government, etc., they had to change their ways of life. They had to really change the paradigm entirely, like in order to rule in the first place. But they're more deeply, like the spiritual attitude had been severely darker, right? Well, it's not really a later a real elaboration of their thought. There surely it was loaded with very strong Apollonian elements as well. But the idea of the crow, of the wolf, all these necrophagous animals, of the darkness, of the fact of this greater sort of gloomy tension of the north, this sort of, if you look at the Germanic art in the first generations after they settled in the Roman world, I mean, you realize that their world was, a nightmare. Like, they thought like of this as in terms of perennial danger, which was fine, traditionally wise, because, as you know, the evil roots always the foundations of the world, the system will fall again. Essentially, the Indo-Europeans who had got the best part of Europe in the south had sort of collapsed themselves because they had contented themselves with this enormous and clamorous and evident success that in the most fertile, productive, developed areas that they had managed to attain. The Germans had not lowered the guards, but they had exactly for this been living in just by this spirituality was reflected by a concrete materiality of danger, instability, misery, brutality, trauma, and all whatever you can think about this. And as such, they were actually morally depressed. Like this, the terrible things that happened, starting especially with the Hunnic arrival and the necessity of migrating into the Roman Empire, etc., like eventually gave them the sense of glory, of victory, of empire that they surely had been partly conferred because the Romans themselves, as you know, settled them in a more or less official way as federati, etc. And especially when the West sort of evaporated, of course, you are left with this most self-evident reality of the Germans, at least as a stock of people, like ruling in the first generation, truly in a truly separated way from the Romance population, eventually amalgamating, but with this idea, sense of this fresher, race that had, been more violent, had not lowered the guard, had been relentlessly brewing, let's say, in the darkness, in the underworld, even to a degree, and then had sprung out once again because of all this ascetic, mystical, warlike, bloodthirsty preparation, is also correct, right? And it is also correct to point out that they had objectively achieved an important degree of power, at least as the peoples that now they claim to be, that, as you know, would soon encompass the entirety of the Roman population as well. We have seen this in many videos about the Longobards, about the Burgundians, the Goths, etc. Like, their legislation was evidently aimed at essentially including all the Romans eventually in their rule, because it sort of made it first of all began immediately as a necessity, because again they couldn't simply handle the entire system alone. They immediately mobilized the Romans. There was always some degree of cooperation, for not talking, especially in the areas like Gaul and Spain, which essentially the local elite had remained more or less intact together with their estates. It was properly a marriage at the elite level that allowed especially the Merovingian Empire to even surpass the Goths in the leadership of Western Europe, and that's why you have Charlemagne later on. Now the question there, that's why I pointed out this this aspect in the video, because it's something we do not know, in part because of the relative lack of interest of the Germans in this literary contemplative lifestyle, and so much in their expression. As you know, before Charlemagne, literacy even among the clergy north of the Alps was pretty pitiful, and that they would have actually thought that the empire at that point was ethnically their own, right? Now this is a very controversial idea. Not much, I actually believe it is true. At least to some extent we know that both ideas remain. Surely there was a sense, especially from the monarchs, that understood especially how much they could get in terms of power delegation from the Romans themselves. I mean, the Merovingians took, like Clovis especially, took everything, like every single damn thing that he could from at that point the Byzantine power delegation, the vicary on the Gauls, the patrician, everything, right? Which was very important to rule mostly Romans, considered that as well. And so this was also interesting because you find it in later times. The Germans truly thought of themselves as the rulers of the Romans to some extent, and especially, however, not of like a random people like another, because the Romans, as we've seen, were the stock that had metaphysically ethnicized the empire as its own. So the Germans had a great reverence actually towards this Roman civilization. They understood its power. In many ways they understood the fact that the empire was still a hell of a thing, meaning Constantinople really impacted the whole world. I mean, think about, the Varangians going to Miklagard and literally saying, wow, this is the deal. Or Anglo-Saxon kings, as I love to remember, in the 10th century, styling themselves not even imperatores, but literally Vasileioi. Right? It's the other end of Europe, and these people were essentially drawing from the Byzantine imperial titles their own properly imperial authority, that there is a history of empire in Britain and in Spain that we normally ignore completely. Like the Anglo-Saxons and the Visigoths thought, and even more the Anglo-Saxons than the Visigoths, telling the truth, of themselves as empire holders. Naturally, our, say, documentary evidence is, as any other, by the way, is extremely limited, but these are not random terms, right? Like, you understand that, in fact, we can't really say what an average Frank or an average Saxon thought about this whole idea of the empire being metaphysically as ethnically Roman in an unchangeable way at that point. Surely everybody was aware of the fact that of the aforementioned collapse that we were pointing out. And so the question remains, and I actually believe in this, of how much did these peoples understand that the empire was Roman or their own ethnicities. I have to make much greater research on this, but I have already covered this on some aspects, and I have all the hints put together, and it's to this level. So essentially the Franks, for how enlightened rulers as Charlemagne or Louis the Pious could be, especially in the broader organization of the ecclesiastical reform of their empire, would never be, let's say, particularly Romanized. At least they were already, but not to the degree, in fact, of thinking of themselves as a Roman people. The Frank, as we've seen, was a very simple person, right? You gave him a sword, a horse, and a Brunia, and with enough land, he could train himself his whole life, and participating to a military expedition or more every single season, massacring as many people as he could, right? The Slavs, Arabs, pagan, some Christian too, you name them, depending on the situation. Just pure and crude brutality that is objectively what the military, on behalf of God, must exercise to our own defense, right? And in their own ethnic ways that were mostly also oral in preservation of their identity and more. We do not actually know much, of course, but we can assume that they didn't actually believe themselves to be Roman at all, even if their emperor was crowned as Roman emperor, and nowhere was he seen as emperor of the Franks, right? Nor by themselves. They probably would have also harbored some sense of paranoia, like, what does this guy want to do? He wants to curb our own prerogatives or whatever. So Charlemagne was king of the Franks, he was king of the Longobards, but he was also Roman emperor, right? And this meant a lot of things. There was a lot of prestige attached to that. We can imagine the same Charlemagne following his father at Pontion when the Pope blessed their family with the allowance of the continuation, like essentially the sacralization of their blood by surely imperial and so traditional. Like, just these guys would have been elected back in the day tribally, and now elevated a bit of higher international level, literally seizing like the title of kings of the Franks from the Merovingians that had essentially lost that the same way like the Romans had done. And surely like these guys were had been raised into deep francia, like they hardly knew what Rome was in a habitual sense. Of course, Rome, as we've seen, was the center of the world for them. They knew that everything sprang from the Holy City. It was some immense power. There was a level of spirituality, but there were also these strange peoples that were the Romans that they sort of knew, also in their Neustria and southern than that. They knew them as mostly like peoples that had sort of been spent, and that this other race of Germans that now they were starting also among the same tribes to recognize each other ethnically, because before the 6th century we do not have any evidence actually of the Germans considering themselves as Germans, and at least in the sense that we cohesively attribute it truly in an ethnic, again, sort of national sense, like the one of the 19th century. And that had been once the deal, not a big deal, but the deal, because they had managed to transcend themselves. Their emperors had truly held the utmost power. The Franks themselves perceived surely themselves within still this, range of transfiguration, but that now had lost in part their power, their control. We can imagine even all the stereotypes, the sense of the fact that also the rulers were normally surely blonde or something, like the same Charlemagne was not an Aryan looking, but let's say this was true also about the ancestral Germans. Not all of them were, the stereotype of the classical sources, but surely there was some sort of ethnic visibility about who was who, and generally speaking, what kind of cultural influences, even among very powerful people, as we recalled before, the Gallo-Romans actually were quite powerful. They blended pretty much with the Frankish elite at a pair level. The same Carolingians actually descended from the Pepinids, but also the Arnulfingians. They would have had a mixed heritage. In particular, I think that the Carolingians as Austrasians would have been more sensitive also to the fact, as we saw in the video about the Battle of Tertry and the rise properly of their dynasty, like how, actually the center of power of the Frankish world was in Austria. That aside from the elites that would speak Germanic until the 10th century, the Western Frankish court was a Roman place, a Romance country. All right? It doesn't matter how more heavily Germanized it had historically been compared to, say, the countries south of the Loire, right? It was still Roman, right? So this is very interesting because at that point, this stock, which we must understand mostly seeing themselves as a spiritual one, right? Think about the same Franks and how important the nobility really was in their people. I mean, there were peoples who were sort of much more egalitarian in their way of, say, dealing with the people in a sort of today we would say democratic, but it's not correct because it's not the demos. It's actually still the freemen that are sort of noblemen themselves. Never make that mistake, even to think that, in fact, today's societies are actually democratic. Fortunately, thank God they are, right? But it doesn't mean either that more shared power, if the standards are high, it's the negative thing. The Anglo-Saxons were like that, for example. The Longobards were like that. The Franks themselves had actually been subjugated by the same Merovingian dynasty itself. Clovis literally beheaded practically all the opposite Germanic chieftains within the Frankish people. There was also some sort of actual cluster of different tribes rather than a really compactly unified thing, and they affirm the genetic dynastic superiority of their blood over the entire rest of the entire world. As a matter of fact, mostly the Frankish one, in the sense that they conquered other peoples and they ruled over them, right? So there was surely a national say a sense of national ethnic superiority. Say the Frank was inherently superior, say, to an Aquitanian or even to an Alemannic say subject. There were the Burgundians, for example, for some reason had sort of blended in politically. Really, the Carolingian Empire was mostly a Franco-Burgundian one, and that's interesting, for example, because, of course, Burgundy and, as we've seen, also the center of Austria were essentially Gaul, Romanized places, while the Alemanni were Germanic, so it's not that easy, first of all, even to see how the thing really was. But surely, as Franks, especially the fierce military elite that had been engineered gradually by within this pretty tumultuous and unstable system, realm/empire ruling over our peoples, would have surely thought in Charlemagne's times to be inherently superior to basically any other people that had conquered. All right. One interesting aspect here to compromise is also, to compromise doesn't mean anything. You see, the Germans in part compromise with the accepting the Romanity of the empire. The Romans did not do that. They didn't say, since Alexander has literally transfigured the world once to a degree, winning a hell of a place in the firmament, we should inherit the Greek Empire. The Romans believed in their own empire, right? In part of this is the very reason why they actually took over much more than the Greeks had accomplished, including the same Greeks. Whereas, as we were saying before, the difficulties of the post-Roman times would bring the Germans even to be further subsumed within this Romanity at their imperial utmost level. This is, for example, something that triggered the 19th century Germanic ethno-nationalists, because they said, why did they chase the Mediterranean Empire when we had our beautiful, Baltic Sea, or, the East to conquer, or whatever. Of course, that was not exactly, a very sensible point, as, of course, the most intelligent thing was to take over, as the other rulers had always done, like the South, the riches, the wealth, like restoring the actual empire, not something like a narrowly ethnic empire, but the entire world, right? And that's something that definitely from medieval times you could not do from a geographically German perspective, if not by starting by essentially founding your own empire in places like Rome or Sicily, as the various Germanic emperors did, and actually almost succeeding. As a matter of fact, that's where the Ghibelline epos really resounds. But aside from this, was just a side note I could have said at the end. But just think about it in perspective. It's like, what kind of moral forces comparatively are moving the system, ethnically wise? I made a video that is explaining this, for example, in an Indo-European perspective, as far as why did the Roman Empire came up in the first place, right? Because all the explanations that you're normally given is, I don't know, because, I don't know, Italy was rich, or because, whatever, like some other power crumbled. What is the entire idea that there is a doctrine of the awakening is completely unknown, like to our threshold of spiritual sensitivity nowadays. So my point in that video, it was not a point of the video, it was just something I said en passant. I appreciate the guy who commented on it because he was listening. Was like what is being also studied already in the Frankish case, that we see it from the general temper of the Frankish legislation that, again, admittedly wasn't very literary oriented. Again, the Franks understood just the language of the sword. That's basically what they were all about. They wouldn't place much emphasis on their Romanity at all. Nor you can objectively expect in the 9th century that, in the 9th century at that point, because this for 1 year, also the 8th century, we are after 800. This people would have any sort of cultural capacity, influence, reason to simply absorb and sort of interiorize the concept that they were Roman, right? Also in their own way of life, actually, they would have seen how big this empire would have regrown, even exceeding the Merovingian one. And so for them it was a great deal. They would have surely contemplated the pride and the greatness of their enterprise, etc. But it's difficult to say how much the average Frankish Trustianus would have seen himself Romanized by that aspect, right? Even if he was serving under a guide that bore the title of Emperor of the Romans. So, unfortunately, we do not have the info that these guys had. This is already a very aristocratically run empire, right? So, as we know, the Gallo-Roman Frankish world was very elite-based, right? There were very few people who owned an enormous amount of wealth, and that just the rest of the people was working for them in the fields. It was also a bit more demilitarized. And so the guys playing on the higher spheres, such as Charlemagne literally being crowned by the Pope in Rome, just by speaking of the scale, truly universal, right? would have played along what was normally like now a fully Christianized, also sort of culturally, linguistically, etc., ecclesiastical historiography that was the only one, say, available, right? Surely there was an epos. Think about Roland and this great feats of heroism that surely had to do with a stratified, sedimented idea of the greatness of the Frankish people. That again was the new chosen people of God. Let's not forget this. Charlemagne was excruciatingly obsessed with self-identifying with David. There was a true love, excitement, and the typical Frankish hematophilia towards like the God Lord of battles, the massive, in fact, biblical bloodshed carried out by the Jews as God's chosen people, again, as the great heroes and winners of the story. This was true for the Romans. Hardly any other people, other than the Jews and the Franks, like would consider themselves as the chosen people of God, like Rome did, and was completely and crystal sure of. All right. We will have to talk more about how the Greeks saw the thing, which was similar to some extent, but also with some greater level of modernization and secularization. It took the brutally rough Macedonians to sort of reawaken that to some point in classical time. Now, little note, the Carolingian Empire collapsed, right, and also relatively fast. So for how much big of a deal it had been, you can argue that Europe had not yet reached that level of cohesion for which this newly unified empire could have been able to stand again. I mean, the extension of the Carolingian Empire geographically and temporally is as powerful, as short as the brutally powerful charge of a Carolingian cavalryman in open field, right? That's what it really embodies, the shot, right? There is something, however, of course, very, very seminal into as we've seen, the Basilidic beneficiary system, the semi-ecclesiastical reformation. Like, there is a lot of the Carolingian legacy that, of course, is truly making a consistent part of our European identity, and say probably also the Western one. And that's a thing. As I'd like also to point out, people like Henry the Fowler were alive and conscient when the Carolingian Empire collapsed. They were already part of the elite. The system was accelerating together with the crisis, with a greater oligarchization of this whole. And we get to the Ottonian times, right? We don't need to present these guys. I made lots of videos about them. There is something truly incredible about them. I mean, the fact that the Saxons, that had been, in fact, the single most primitive and underdeveloped people, aside except the Frisians, among those that the Franks had brought down, specifically in the Saxon case, with one of the single most radically brutal, violent, and bloody ways that history records. In many ways, this is actually the product of the incredibly proud Carolingian propaganda that said we literally massacred them or deported, when actually we see that it was not really true. The bloody court of Verdun was a bit not made up. Some Saxons were beheaded there, but it wasn't just like the massacre of thousands that the same Franks told us, right? So that people, for some reason, in the 21st century are obsessed with this idea, oh, this guy killed so many people, so worse than the other, whatever. They don't understand anything, of course, about the entire story. But aside from that, like, the Saxons learned the Romano-Frankish lesson, the Christian Romano-Frankish lesson, the hardest way. Let's put it in these terms. And there was something evidently kicking into them for which these would have been not just Christianized for good and sort of Frankicized for good and being part of the empire, even at the moment of the collapse of the same, but literally reviving the empire. And not just a Frankish empire, but under their dynasty, an ethnically and I really mean it in a metaphysical sense, Roman Empire. Again, the imperial title was always there. But what the Ottonians were particularly interested in, especially after Otto II married that sort of second-hand but still Byzantine princess, and so in theory a Roman one. Remember that the Byzantines wouldn't, at this point there was an usurper on the throne, we've seen all the story, so it was sort of a shitty deal. It's not that they actually got like the greatest Porphyrogenita princess that would inject Romanity into the stock through her womb, etc. Here we're talking about, and it would have been a very legalistic principle in the first place, but we're talking again an arrangement for which Otto III, especially their child, as you know, that would literally rule in Rome with the palace on the Palatine Hill, just like the ancient Roman emperors, and also without too much success, because at a certain point the Romans kicked him out. The Romans weren't easy people to cope with in general, especially like, yes, in the ancient times, as as a whole, but also properly as citizens of the city of Rome during the Middle Ages. The Pope also knew something about this, including the fact that the Pope had met with Pippin and Charlemagne as a kid, etc., because he had literally been thrown out of Rome on that occasion. But never mind. The sense of this all is that, of course, for many reasons, we can simply digress on the Ottonians that were campaigning in Italy, in southern Italy, where there had been the Byzantines, there would be the Byzantines, they had this tie, they had now revived truly like a regional power, like including essentially Germany, in fact, central northern Italy, and much of the south actually. Hadn't they lost at the Battle of Cotrone, and the Germans had been massacred by the Saracens, actually, it would have been a massive imperial presence in southern Italy in the following centuries. It would have not been the Normans there, it would have been a completely different story. There was Burgundy as well, there was this other important chunk, plus like essentially the Bohemians would get into the story, while also the Germans were expanding fast. Like the Ottonians wouldn't really have a strongly centralized empire. In some sense, they suffered the same problem the Carolingians had. But it is true, and by historiographical convention, in fact, we start considering the Holy Roman Empire from Otto I crowning, which is incorrect, because that crown had been truly, as the guy observed in the comment, Roman all along, right? And holy as well. There is no doubt about this. And it was literally the same crown that every emperor had before, Romanly speaking. There is no doubt about this either, right? The Byzantine legalistic thing is just BS, but for some reason people think about this, And as we know, Otto III doesn't call himself like a Saxon, a German. He literally says that he is Roman. Yeah, he had Byzantine blood, admittedly, but it wasn't the point. The point is that the Ottonians decide that this, from now on, is truly the revival of the former Roman Empire. Now, even about them, we do not know how much, the same, for example, Otto III would have believed something like this, nor what, say, his grandfather Otto I would think about this. But one thing we do know, however, that in spite of the fact that this Romanity was shouted from all the possible pulpits, that the Ottonians had symbolically, literally, like in this sense, their court was much more refined than the Carolingian one. They got lots of Byzantine stuff as well through that marriage. There was really an obstentation of Romanity, including the same rule over Italy and like all the package. This empire was sort of fragile as well. It was sort of less fortunate, even the Carolingian one, at least in the Ottonian dynastic sense. But of course the Holy Roman Empire sort of remained, and from there on, the Germans would maintain the sense of Romanity. Now, sticking to the Ottonian times, we do know, however, that there are many hints, some of which are very literally famous, and we will be seeing soon, hopefully, that these Saxons didn't like at all the fact that their emperor had declared himself ethnically Roman. They didn't. They said this empire is the empire, say, of the Saxons, or the Franks, as they still considered themselves, because they considered also in that case the Franks to have been the chosen people that had transfigured the whole system, and so in this case was not much like the Saxon provincial dimension that mattered, but the fact that this was a Frankish empire, like a part of the same. Like, consider how they literally intended the continuity of the empire, right? In an essential fashion. So the sense that there was a difference, let's say, between the Romans and the Germans was still pretty much alive, especially among the people like the Saxons, was even more detached from Romanity historically. I mean, these guys had been brought under Christianity just 1 century before by the Franks. They had always been there in, that's Central Europe technically, but it's almost Northern Europe. They had never historically been connected up to that point with Rome, even though they, universally sort of knew perfectly well what was going on, how many Saxon auxiliaries had really served in the Roman army back in the day, that there was a great participation to the sense of Romanity, but in a politically institutional way. Of course, Romanity was something very distant. And Widukind of Corbeil, even the same Liutprand of Cremona as an Italian subject, but that considered himself a Longbard, hence a German. There's a very beautiful passage, very famous in the Antipodosis, that says literally, we, the Longobards, the Franks, the Saxons, etc., actually depreciate the Romans. And this was written as a pamphlet against the Byzantine emperor. There was an ale, objectively, but this is what they would have liked to tell them, because this was the fake, at least, the fictional answer that Liutprand would have given as an imperial ambassador of the Holy Roman Empire at Constantinople, right, where he was also detained for a while. At least, not imprisoned, but say detained. And so the sense was that there was some sort of ambiguity. We spot this. We never see, we are Germans, we had nothing to do with the Romans about the empire. But there was the idea that the same Augustan title, for example, had been revived for Otto I without the qualification of Roman at some point, at least at home, because, of course, the crowning was explicitly Roman. By the way, I would like to stress that in the ritual of the imperial crowning in Rome, it's not just being crowned by the Pope, but to be acclaimed by the Roman, to be recognized by the Roman people as emperor. There were all the, naturally not the Roman people, as, yes, there would have been somebody celebrating this, but I mean, the Roman people means in the church there is the Roman nobility that is incredibly self-aware of its international role, because Rome always remained incredibly central in all the matters of the Byzantine and the Frankish empires throughout all this. Also for the obvious reasons that they elected the popes, or at least at this point things were changing, but because there was a heavy interference. Think about the Theophil Acts, right? That's what prompts the Ottonians to sort of, even in insight, start the investiture controversy, because they start appointing their own popes. They were Germans, etc. So this aspect, I think, it's very fascinating, because there is a sort of a void of the idea that is Romanity. It's as if the Saxons had been sort of the most behind-the-scene guys in terms of all the mess that was happening, including their own conquest by the Franks. The mess starting from the migration era, the various conflictuality, the way they knocked out the Thuringians together with the Franks, and they started raiding the same Rhineland, and they got mercilessly subjugated by Charlemagne, all this kind of stuff, right? And in all this, it's as if they said as a third party, but okay, we may have been defeated by the Franks, but the Romans are the worst, right? Because we all know that we are, as Germans, something else. And I think that this spirit actually existed there. naturally this was surpassed because the nobility, the elite, the ruling, like held imperial family, like, were of course all projected towards Romanity, towards Italy, towards the Mediterranean Empire, towards the obviously most sensible thing that everybody would have done in those situations. I mean, the Ottonians wouldn't be able to rule even half of Germany directly. The same goes for Italy, but they could simply float over all these peoples so that they could get that enough surplus to maintain some imperial presence here and there to solve matters. That's how most like the empire up to that point had been functioning in the West. Also because, especially in places like Germany, there hadn't really ever been a state, which is something you may want to notice in all this, because it's not like these cultural differences are sort of random, right? So this was just to answer that question, meaning, yes, the empire had always been Roman, but not necessarily peoples like the Franks or the Saxons would have actually believed that they would have been, in that sense, that this would have been true. Or at least they had to adapt to the situation, because after all it was negotiating the title with a great part of Romanity, and because they had to be the emperor of the Romans as well. Reflect on this again. And this is interesting because for example, the Franks had the upper hand over the Papas. It's not that the Pope dictated ever since Charlemagne. Okay, now you have the title of the Roman, imperial title of the Romans, and simply things are like, because we impose you the Romanity. But the Franks, to some extent, could do a bit what they would have liked. They could have made things taking different turns, including the fact that they could have taken this as a hereditary prerogative. There was a point, truly, until Louis the Pius, that could have also not have repeated the Roman crowning. This is also a very well-known historiographical thing, but they still decided it was better to do so, because obviously getting that conferred them a much greater international prestige. It would have won like a much greater papal support. It would have won, in part, the same actual sympathy of the Romans, or at least those peoples that, in spite considering themselves ethnically, which means juridically in this case Germanic, were sort of aware of the fact that they were Roman, right? At the same statement of Liutprand, that obviously spoke a Romance language, even if he thought himself to be a German Longbard, right? Or Germanic Longbard, says it all, right? It was a sense even of controversy and of pain in the realization of what had happened to the empire, that the role that the Romans had ethnically speaking. So the idea is that acquiring even the Germanic identity was a redemptional way of saying we are maybe like from the other side. But as you understand, it's from the very top that the Romanity is reasserted ethnically throughout the entire Middle Ages. Like if you read German sources of imperial kind, etc., they're literally saying we are Roman, like we are the emperors of the Romans, our Roman Majesty, whatever. On the battlefields, also in vernacular sources written in, say, Styria in the 13th century, we know that, for example, at the Battle of Markfeld, the German knights shouted in front of the Bohemian host, "Here is Rome." Right? If this had been just like a fiction, like you would have found evidence in the sources of the fact that yes, there was, I don't know, we are not really Roman, we're German or whatever. Of course, to some extent, they would call themselves German, but it's never in a positional sense to the Romanity. It was an enormous privilege and honor and pride of the same Germans that, in that sense, also monopolized the imperial title, the Roman imperial title for their own nation, which at some point during the 12th century, I made some videos about this, like even English authors, etc., began to say, well, why do the Germans do this? Like, isn't the empire and Romanity like something bigger than that? Like, why the Germans? What happened? This is yet another topic. So this was not like the answer to a question, but it was just being more precise about the fact that obviously and surely for people today, the most important thing to remember is how the commentator said that is correct and that I always espoused in my videos. But basically, Schwerpunkt is also based on this, that of course the Romanity of the empire is inescapable still today. And that's the simple reason why there's never been an empire that's been surpassed the Roman one in any sensibly, impactful way, right? There is no, this is not about size. Extensionally, has nothing to do with, all the ancient peoples would have laughed at you for stating something like that. You care about the dirt, not about heaven. Of course, no other empire that existed historically had the same level of, let's say, of legacy, like of influence, like Rome did, also in this truly perennial, like think about what happened during the migration era, again, the wars, the reconquests, etc. But yet this concept prevailed in a tacit way because they really thought that Romanity had the transcendental power of achieving what had been achieved. It could be hopefully restored. So it must have been rough for the Germans as well to confront themselves with this. And no doubt, however, and that's why I made that minimal reference that I'm glad somebody caught, to the fact that probably not all the Germans agreed on the fact that their emperor was Roman. And that there was something actually bad about saying that, because it was like, it's our Saxon empire, right? It's not like the Roman. We are the Saxons. We are the people who did that. We are the superior stock who took over the rest of the world, apparently, at least, as we were pointing out since the beginning, with ever less punching power than Rome had done. This is to answer the first question, or what was the second, but whatever. Now, the first one was something, again, it's deleted now, so I don't know, but it was something along this pattern. This was about the video on, again, the Napoleonic Code, the fact, our last video about the history of law, at least from the branch of the cycle that discussed it. And the fact that there is, and there is another video on this as well made, that within that era, the Napoleonic War in general, when through the code Napoleon, the state becomes the sole source of law, and so the civil law is reinstated it's instated to that truly absolutistic level, right, in at least juridically. There is something about the survival of the common law, for example, in the Anglo-Saxon tradition. It must be understood at some cultural level, right? And the reason why I'm really trying to remember, because it's pretty clear what happened, but I'm trying to phrase it in a way that is as accurate as possible, because I don't have the text now, is that I made some sort of criticism to the fact that among the various things that has not necessarily to do with what I just said about Napoleon and whatever, but the fact that, let's say, the way people, say, humanity degenerates to some extent, it has been degenerating spiritually speaking, so we're missing the capacity of reawakening, takes on different characteristics depending on the people, right? And I made the point that within common law, that, as you know, is sort of more it's based on jurisprudence, first of all, and so it has some sort of more flexible, innovative, and debatably, this is the point of the question, empirical, pragmatic character. The sense of, and again, like, this is not the point, but I mean, the level of empirical approach to reality, and so something that is in theory decisionally taken ad hoc by the single person, has somehow degenerated in the, again, the world goes down, and so I have nothing against Anglo-American culture in its traditional roots, but of course in the way it degenerates, as the word degenerates, there is an empiricistic bias in that culture, and especially, and I was bringing the thing at the level of like, how does a juridical system allow the reawakening of the transcendental principle? And I was making the case that there is sometimes a self-referential attitude in the Anglo-American world regarding, say, essentially the superiority of their system. That during Napoleonic times substantiates itself in a ferocious criticism against the French Revolution and the way it was enacted. Now, as you know, I'm a medievalist, and I mean, there are things that happened during the French Revolution that are probably the greatest tragedy in the history of mankind. I'm not talking about killed people. The terror actually was a much bloodless thing that it's normally credited compared to some of the greatest massacres happening profusely, for example, during the age of confessional clashes in the previous centuries, if we're not talking about the bloodbaths regularly happening in the wars of the time. So there's been legitimately criticism to Jacobinism, to this sort of almost communistic direction. The idea that the Fourth Estate was actually manipulated into this by the Third Estate, that is the real responsible of the French Revolution. And that Burke, like all that current, would like to make you think that the French Revolution, in its essence and in its civil principles and in its also juridical fundamentals, is entirely wrong. Right? It's not to say that I have any particular sympathy towards certain, in fact, incredibly modernistic and secularistic, even say not majoritarily, and that's the point I'm making, like atheistic and sort of democraticistic aspects of the French Revolution. And my criticism was just bear in mind that also on the Anglo-American side there is something wrong with the idea that doctrine doesn't matter, and that essentially just the empirical notion of whatever works, so just do it and don't care about the causes, is not, and just give blind faith to people just per se, opposite to the revolution, was with the Code Napoleonic, this really actually imposing the state's law on the citizens that would have, in that sense, been brought down, not really freed as lesser people out there in the wild without any rule or law, is not exactly the best thing you can do. And this is not a criticism, say, also in the Reddit discussion, and I don't attribute this also to the author of the question that is very intelligent, was making a very interesting point also speaking of Romanity, and we will get to that, that I have anything against Anglo-Saxon culture. I just think that every culture has problems, and that maybe since I'm a continental European, like, you don't talk about other people's problems, especially when they constitute, these people constitute the majority of your followers. But as you know, I'm very straightforward, and I don't care, because I think that it's a serious and important thing. I mean, I want Anglo-Saxon culture to prosper, to really resume the best of itself. And that has in fact hardly anything to do with what, in fact, it has become now, which is not an Anglo-Saxon civilization, right? It is still, like, I do believe that I'm not the guy who's saying, let's, that supports the side of, the culturally underdeveloped of the world, just self-sabotaging the West at all. I actually have a high opinion of the Anglo-American world in many ways. And that's why I want to see it rise, because I don't think, it's to be given for lost. Even if objectively living in our world, like the entire world seems to be lost, there is nobody on the horizon that has any minimal trace of capacity to handle anything. Starting especially from those who try to mess up the entire system, failing, by the way. And while these things are happening, of course, I care about pointing out that there is all a historical reason why I say that all this set of attitudes, especially starting from the idea of lack of imposed regulation, right? Think about how much the concept of tyranny, since the Magna Carta has been thrown around to inform in the Anglo-Saxon world, also unfortunately part of the this is again, from the other side we have other problems, like, but from that side the idea is that the problem is the tyrant. It's a hypocritical deresponsabilization of the individual that, of course, has always the power to transcend everything, including earthly rulers, and that instead starts whining about conspiracy theories, about the terrible elite that does stuff, and so what are you, right? This is a bit just like racist, racist people in general. Like, if your race is inherently superior to one another, why are you complaining about losing? Like, don't you think there is some problem with that? Like, it's evidently not just a zoological determinism. There is the capacity of the spirit managing to mold and upwards the same somatic genetic aspect. So where are you in all this? What are you doing? Right? The truth is that there is a generalized crisis that goes far beyond what kind of your skin pigmentation is. And even though there are absolutely, like, radical cultural divides in the world, and there's not even and they're much more rigid and pronounced than even most racist people today understand, because mostly are a bunch of radically undereducated people. That the other idea, in fact, is that you don't even need to educate people, right? It's the sense, even I see it just in Anglo-American conservatism, just, I don't know, don't even study, just start a business, whatever it is, and you'll become rich magically. And if you succeed, you can brag about it. If you don't, like, never mind. We'll just, end up with, on the street with some, fentanyl overdose or something like that. The entire sense that of this, let's be honest, it derives from Calvinism, right? It derives from the most, in fact, despicable fringes of Protestant ideology that basically just by itself denies any value to work, and basically just, like, takes on an almost collectivistic idea. If you think about it, there is something almost socialistic in it, because if the community matters everything and you don't count, to the point that, of course, your works do not count, and if you succeed, it's just like some accident for which you can, in theory, brag about the fact that God sort of gave you this, except for no merit whatsoever, according to your religion. I don't know what kind of schizophrenic world can emerge from this. So I know I'm being very harsh on this, but this is also why that sense of empiricism arrived, and there is also a much more sort of fourth estate or problem to that, which sort of we all had with the rise of the fourth estate everywhere in our world, and that in the American one, for example, substantiated itself with Fordism and Taylorism. And so the narrowing down of people's cerebral capacities to, first of all, essentially a materialistic subservience to whatever, like there are some big guys that objectively succeed. Like the interesting, I should have made this premise that the Anglo-American war has been clamorously successful, and that's why I was saying before that I have actually an enormous sympathy for it, because I truly believe that that power is deserved. There is no such thing in traditional doctrine like a power deriving from evil. That's agnostic heresy. It has absolutely nothing to do with the Catholic tradition, and the truth being that, yes, might is right, because if you were better, at least this is in relative terms, like every form of power definitely derives from God, right? And if there is somebody that is so powerful that can rule over you, the point is that your inferiority is caused by you. It's not caused by this person, right? I know that ever more people believe that nothing is a big deal, actually. It's what is saying, mortality. It's not my problem, right? It happened to me. I hope to be lucky in my life. But death, illnesses, suffering, pain has nothing to do with my fault, right? What does and literally this derives from the fact that materialistic, collectivistic mentality poured into, say, Engels, that dirty animal, said back in the day that capitalism, which does not exist, by the way, it's just it's called free market, it's the communistic term to indicate, to justify how they want to steal your money, as the parasites that they are, would have opened to the way of the fourth estate. Surprise, surprise! Look at what is happening in America, right? And why that happens? Who did let those people out in the first place, right? It is really happening, and it definitely happened through that complete detachment through materialistic, technologistic, productivistic, progressistic, just whatever works. Let's not think about the doctrinal fundamentals of it, and that's unfortunately what happens. You radically lower the standards of people that, when you talk about, the birth even of these countries, like we're talking about in post, of course, we're talking about the well after the Ghibelline world, right? So at that point, the masses were a bit everywhere, the way the world was heading is not just about the Anglo-American culture, it's also about the continental one, was, of course, reducing awareness, whatever, but in this sense, you cannot think that simply by rebelling to even an oppressive ruler, and winning a war against it, it's ipso facto just winning you the right to be ideally a completely free people that nobody has to even try to impose anything on. By the way, the United States also has not been that historically quite soon, because it had to be ruled, right? And if peoples were angels, of course, we wouldn't need a state, but since we aren't, the state actually has this transfiguring capacity. And that's actually also what I was also saying regarding the French Revolution. After all, France maintained that also degenerated quite quickly, as you understand it. Also think about the problems of mass immigration and the denaturation and the hatred actually towards the clergy, towards those monarchic institutions that had truly had an imperial meaning, that made France actually the best Catholic representative, imperially wise, in Europe, as we also were discussing before, declined, but still with a hell of a state, with a hell of a power, with a hell of an empire, today with nuclear weapons, in a way that does still hold true, and it's very difficult to do so, the values of Western civilization. And that stemmed for sure also from the rigid imposition that civil law had in its Napoleonic form to order a state of people that were recognized by the beginning of the 19th century, obviously not being historically able to simply be randomly autonomous people, but necessarily being framed under a rigid statal rule. And actually, the French armies of just of the Revolutionary Wars, not just of Napoleonic times, were actually a cut, right? Even these for being conscripts, they fought clamorously well because this order still allowed them to balance their newly acquired rights, right? You're not simply free out of nothing. You're free in the sense that you're never free. You're a liber, rather, which means that you have been conferred particular autonomy. The state will give you the protection, the rights, what you need as a bare minimum to realize that you matter as a person because you have a divine spark within yourself. But don't flatter yourself too much because you cannot do it alone, right? And so this infantilistic idea that a person can be free, that freedom must be attained as an ultimate rule, but freedom belongs only to God. It doesn't belong to humans, so it cannot belong by definition to countries. Of course, the more, in this sense, the greater freedom you give to the greater, say, level. I use freedom because in English you do not really have, I would say, autonomy in that sense. But yes, let's use this. The greater autonomy you give to the individual in a system doesn't mean that autonomy will be fruitful. There is a difference between potential and act, right? It's just like mixing, which, as unfortunately, in fact, communists do, opportunity and outcome. They're two radically different things that have nothing to do with one another. And they're always the outcome is always the fruit of somebody's actualization of the self. They can be also null, right? But in this regard, freedom cannot exist if there are states, right? Freedom could, in theory, even exist in an empire that is, however, the one of God on earth, once again. And states can be, and ethnicities can be, and different beliefs also, like religiously wise, can be. I mean, I would have to explain in this sense why even a Protestant world, like is by majority, like the Anglo-American one, was also so clamorously successful. Evidently, that's not just the discriminant, right? Surely there is some liberatory sense that these peoples had also at the fringe of Europe, speaking of England, to actually try to stand with their own legs, to have greater autonomy, to try this sort of autocephalic, for example, ecclesiastical, administration, also connected with the royal prerogatives there is a lot going on we have to talk about. But in this sense, the outcome is the only thing that matters, not because it happens by chance or because some whim of God that you can't even perscrutate, but because the only way you have to obtain anything is through your own work meeting God's favor. And if your work is right, you will get that, you will get power. And so you must cultivate that sort of ascetical preparation and not concentrating on this obsessive cult of material objects, in the sense it's not that you shouldn't have it or that wealth in this sense is bad, right? It can corrupt you to an extent, but if you're weak, right, you shouldn't even be scared by wealth. There are people who are very wealthy and perfectly know what's the value of it, but of course evaluate much more like the spirituality needed to handle it successfully, and so that they make even more money. So this emphasis on success pursued as opposed to like the backwards direction seen where the morals stem from is in this sense a problem of that empiricism that I was pointing out before, right? It is true that it's the same success of the Anglo-American culture, the early industrialization, the British Empire, think about the incredibly fast U.S. growth and power and world control. Like there is something incredibly this is not, of course, I refuse to make parallelism, as I was saying, with the Roman Empire in general, because it doesn't make sense. But in that sense of world leadership, these things were won. Everything Wu spits on it because it's actually complex about the inferiority of its own culture. is very easily seen, right? The Anglo-Americans did really rule the world at some point, and there is nothing that you can do about that, right? And I'm extremely thankful, even for just, if you look at the major anniversary that is going to come up, tomorrow I have a little surprise for you, is quite self-evident. You can't see, but how even ourselves, like as a continental European, like of the Western Bloc, I'm perfectly aware of the fact that my family obtained like so much from the Anglo-American success as well, and how can't you feel transfigured in part by this? How can't you feel a bit like Anglo-American yourself, when not just for the culture, the proximity of it, but literally the fact that these are the guys who made the deal, right? Then I know that there is all the side of the story that says, oh no, it's better if the Nazis had won World War II. I will not comment on this. But the question is, without any doubt, in fact, also in this case, that the Nazis lost. And they lost even pretty badly. Right? So it's not even to say that, tradition has only one rule. Again, might is right. And there is no doubt that the Nazis, not because they were Nazis, but because, there was a German culture behind it, were sort of more advanced, more qualitative and whatever than others, that they took out during World War II, so that this doesn't make, say, the Nazis, again, a successful recipe also for the way they were crushed by also peoples that were deemed to be inferior. And, right, but you must understand that civilizational hierarchy that people are so scared today to trace. To go back to the question, it was actually interesting because it referred to Romanity, like saying, like, because the guy said something like, Romanity was, speaking of Roman law, it came to be out of a pretty empirical background itself, and as I was saying myself in the video, like, notoriously, Roman law was common law at the beginning. And the reason why it became civil law and what that means, of course, I spent like a couple of years explaining the series about the history of law. All right. So the guy, because this is really the question, and to make the long story very short, said, but isn't that level of empirical capacity good also for Rome? Like, isn't that the key of success, together with the famous Roman pragmatism that can be seen in part also as the empirical side of the story? There is one major point in this. First of all, one is linguistical, like a little premise. Like when I say, just for the record and future videos, if I say empirical, and I say it's too unbalanced towards an empiricism, right? I really mean that there is an excess of a certain thing. It's as if you had all these necessary qualities that you need to make civilization work, and if you exceed for one of them disproportionately, that becomes a problem. Hence, empirical, okay. Empiricistic, bad, right? So, common law, the Anglo-American culture is good, also because it's empirical. Right, because it, historically speaking, I can't say it's empirical in the sense that just that is empirical and no other country is. Like, it exists, it's a thing. And the Anglo-American world, sort of, for part of the aforementioned reasons, the fact that it had sort of had refused in part, like, for example, Papal Imperials already escaped it, etc. Like, it had to set its own standards, right? And since they were very successful, thanks to, for example, the colonial expansion, their will to explore, to conquer, to mold the world, and so all those resources that evidently were present in Anglo-Saxon culture, that I can't stress enough how much I admire, managed to make them acquire so much wealth, and the way they would organize this unprecedented level of power would be very empirical, in the sense that there was already an inclination towards like scientific subjects as opposed to the humanistic ones. There is something you still see today, for example, also for the worst, by the way, because they also degenerate in that communistic way, and even conservatives are not capable of understanding anymore that they need a humanistic education in order to be education in humanities to be an actual person, right? It's something that radically separates us in that sense from continental world, and at least a part of it, mostly the western part. Because unfortunately, socialism did exist on the other side, and that also left pretty traumatic scars that we are still all collectively faking not to see, and that are actually pretty much out there in a disastrous fashion, to say the least. Say empiricism too, philosophically speaking, was a thing, especially from Britain, that came to, especially during the Enlightenment, like to exceed towards that direction, so reducing the importance of spirituality, religion, or at least it was there. The founding fathers had a heavy religious education, for example. Speaking of the US, it's often sort of misunderstood, but in part this was also skipped because the idea was the old Anglo-Saxon way of saying, well, we do not need really to fix too much on the doctrine, because that can be sclerotic, right? They had that bad papistic experience, and so they, at least in their view, they had taken it badly, and they decided, like, we act mostly by having confidence in ourselves, and this did really open to an important level of potential, right, in the Anglo-Saxon world that still also by reflection has been brought back on us, right? For example, after World War II, and but also was something that you can see balanced in a different way in the same French Revolution after all. I mean, after all, those rights were given, people were told to be relevant, just you needed a hierarchy that was, for example, Britain maintained a particular institutional order, while the United States were born out of the rejection of that. So it's never like the same thing everywhere, but there are similar things sometimes in between situations that normally are rigidly separated, right? Think about English historiography literally denying to have had a revolution in the 17th century after the French had one later in 1 century afterwards. These things did happen. There was some sense of complex of issue also towards like the continental world, towards the Catholic world, that truly sort of altered even our own perception of those historical events, because we still read them, even as continental Europeans, because of cultural popular influence, through the Anglo-American documentary explanation of the story, right? And this is a serious issue, right? At least I deeply believe that these talks should be had in order to come all together with a united view of the world in all its complexity, naturally, not just picking sides arbitrarily, but this is exactly what at some point was started to be done without criterion. The point between the Romans and how eventually systems sclerotized, the Romans happened to sclerotize in the same way. Just the other yesterday was actually talking about Diocletian's reforms, how the system had exhausted, they need more bureaucracy, more state, because people were not able to handle the system autonomously. People had much less freedom than before because they had already lost it themselves. Society changes in certain way, etc., etc. That's why also Christianity comes around to fix the problem, as I was saying before, also in the introduction to the Renovatio Imperii, etc. Now, the fact that the Romans were very empirical doesn't mean that their spiritual situation was, at the moment of the creation of their own common Roman law, the same of, let's say, the Anglo-Saxons of the American War of Independence. All right, we're talking about 2,000 years of distance from that. And as I was saying before, you cannot compare the 18th century average guy, right, that lives in the Appalachians and does not want to pay taxes and actually doesn't care absolutely anything, which may even be a positive thing about all the Enlightenment, or at least some aspects of it. Zero, right? They read the Bible, the almanacs, pretty much it. Like, they had no other education whatsoever. from, let's say, the Roman in the relation with his fides in a metaphysical sense. You have 2,000 years of human degeneration, morally and spiritually, and you cannot apply the same mold, like to, of course, I'm not saying this to the author of the comment that understands this, but let's say, stressing the fact that the human spirit molds reality just directly to its level of quality, I think it's pretty self-evident. There are the swings in history between giving too much trust, autonomy, or taking too much of it away, right? And civilization is always like finding the right balance in between. But also according, not in a purely formally institutional way, like saying, I don't know, the French Revolution was bad because it had these principles. I don't like these principles because these principles are absolute. Because the French people are not the Hungarian people, are not the Irish people, are not the Spanish people, right? So what France underwent also as a major, so as the hegemonic power that had continentally become under Louis XIV, had needed, for example, much more iron fist than, say, what the English gentry did, right? Saying, I think, say the English Revolution were quite indicative of the different degree of autonomy that particularly different estates developed historically in a different way had really wanted. I mean, Britain had the Magna Carta. It was also a more primitive system, telling you the truth. It was a smaller system. France was something else. Again, it was the hegemonic continental power. It had an unprecedented level of monarchic power. It had a massive military. It had always had to cover these vast spaces without even too many geographical boundaries, especially towards Central Europe. Like, you cannot presume that what happened during the French Revolution would have, for any other reason, been shared by other peoples in the same way. Even when the revolution is exported, say, I don't know, in other countries in Europe through Napoleonic times, it doesn't actually work in the same way elsewhere. Napoleon decides that, for example, certain German states require, actually, they don't need a change. They can continue with their own local mix of common and Roman law. The Italian states instead mostly need something more similar to the French one. There are all different systems at play. It's not just the empirical quality that, of course, is very much needed, and in the way, say, the revolutionary reforms sort of required, like the creation of a unprecedented level of statal development and control, right? It was proportionate to that level of functionality, of governability, and one also of the autonomy of the people. Is very empirical, and as it is actually very pragmatic, because the comment was revolving around also pragmatism, like Roman pragmatism as well, and so I had thrown out around the term in the previous video, by saying there was hardly any more pragmatic people than the Roman, in that sense, because the Romans had a much simpler view of what mattered as an ancient warlike people in terms of power and how to affirm it and how to realize that, yes, the stronger have the right to rule on the weaker. If these display weakness, they have themselves ruled over, right? A bit like the sense of the American Revolution, like it was won mostly at sea by foreign powers, but say, like what the Americans displayed in their homeland was really extraordinary. in a historical sense. It deeply affected, it deeply transfigured the rest of the world. And this cannot be unseen, right? So the root difference in that sense between the modern world, Anglo-American or not, and the Roman one is that the Roman one was much more attentive to the standards and how this, of course, affected, say, the relation of the individual with the deity. And so what is that, say, the much greater awareness that it wasn't just about some random quality of the individual, but its need to obtain power from God through its deeds, its works, that made the Romans so empirical and practical and pragmatic to mold the world in the way we have seen. The bourgeois revolution of the 18th century is something completely detached from that. They basically have a sclerotized elite that should have maintained the standards of Roman times, basically collapsed under the pushing mass of the fourth estate, manipulated by the third estate that was actually sort of the one that also by size was becoming sort of capable of carrying out this regime change, and that was, say, entrepreneurial, crafty enough to say, okay, well, it's our turn now, but anthropologically, individually, like being actually a lower kind in standards and relation with the divinity, it was being not forgotten, but, say, much adulterated and sort of losing in meaning. Also, especially overthrowing the true traditional symbolisms and erasing them from, for example, the school programs and the educational aspect of the story. That is very serious, because they started also to educate the fourth estate at some point, and they did that through, of course, what had nothing to do with the ancien regime. Even though the ancien regime did not simply disappear, like still the nobility was there and those values were there, but they were also being diluted into the mass of the lesser people. And so this is not even to say that the lesser people did not improve in quality to some extent. That is relative in nature, because you can legitimately say that even a peasant, say, of the 12th century was a much more intelligent and capable person than you are. Many people simply can't accept this. Like, they think that intelligence means just their sort of theoretical bubbling aspect of the 21st, how intellectual capacities were coming to be thought in the 21st century, and they would simply starve to death because they have absolutely zero idea how even to apply themselves were they actually 12th century peasants. And they, of course, do not have the moral backbone, the resilience, the strength, the capacity, the sort of the courage and the boldness, even as peasants, that definitely by those time standards were considered as cowards, etc. And because we have exactly severed that connection with the Catholic condition, like we have exorcised and camouflaged our own mortality and sufferance and pain. If you get cancer, it's just because, we're unlucky, right? It's not maybe part of why are we even here? Like, why do we have to suffer? What is suffering? What is death? Why do we die? Like, science has literally zero idea about this. It can just describe the mechanical process, but it even refuses at some point to acknowledge that there was a doctrine of transcendence that at least seems, even empirically, to match all the best ways of life that actually can improve our own in a very qualitative sense, even materially speaking, physically speaking, if they were just followed. And that's something that we're barely becoming aware of just now, even with the realization that we can essentially alter our genome through our ways of life, and our way of life is always lazier, weaker, frail, because exclusively of our choices we've been taught just to relax and take it easy because there is somebody else paying for our weakness, because we can't store lots of stuff, because somebody did succeed, because they were using the right ways, but they also didn't bother thinking too much why, and not leaving us with the adequate doctrine for keeping to insist in that moral value. So you see, it's not that there isn't a value behind Fordism or Taylorism, or better, what Ford and Taylor did and sort of organized. They succeeded because they were right in what they were doing. But if this had been backed instead with a sort of financiaristic sort of successism, I don't even know how to say this, rather than, okay, let's see why it was so good, also on the grounds of our traditional knowledge, right? Then you can't complain that things go downhill, right? So this is actually not a response specifically to the person who commented on it, wrote something incredibly intelligent in the comment, especially about the nature like of Roman law and how it evolved, etc. And so how things really changed. But I would give as an answer, reflect on this, like reflect on what was the relation with God of an ancient Roman, and in fact what the relation with God was by an 18th century peasant from New England, right? That's incredibly important. That's not just a rhetorical question. That's real. It's a real historical exercise. It's a very difficult one, for that matter. But in that sense, you should include in where did 18th century New England peasants come from historically? Because we're talking just 200 years after the Renaissance. I mean, they're incredibly primitive and archaic times. And there are different, I mean, in New England, I don't know, people at that time still burned women at the stake for witchcraft. Like in the papacy already by the Renaissance, it was considered like a ridiculous idea. So let's see the history of peoples also in perspective, and why, say, what is that we should actually be scared of, and what is that we should be instead more aware of in a. You see, even the last example that I produced is significant, because we never talked so much about witchcraft, but there was a very specific reason why people would burn at the stake that for the time being were actually incredibly intelligent. Also, we've been, let's say, like there was an evolution, as we were saying, even in single individual quality was still not that much, but at least it was not enough to believe in witchcraft anymore. Maybe to believe in much worse things that at that point brought new wars, and think about communism or other stuff that were actually part of the same witchcraft aspects. So it's never as easy as it sounds, but there is also some. In fact, this is what I would like to leave even as a proponent of tradition. That what you see in modernity today is not something you should. There's something very bad about it, but there is something very good about it, and the reason why it's good, such as the fact that you are born in a truly autonomous, say in a free world, we call the free world, and that you have some rights, you have some opportunities. It's something that you should take as a blessing, and it is a part of tradition. Then if you fail at it because you complain that you have imaginary mental illnesses, which means that you're just too lazy to do anything because you're a spoiled brat, or spending your life eating Cheetos, watching TikTok videos, like, the problem is you, right? Modernity does not exist. Only tradition does. And tradition tells us that everything that works, it's because there is a good reason why it does. Because there is no other power but God. Say nothing but God behind power, to make it sound better. And so if you are faulty, you should ask yourself why you are. And it's not the world around. Because tradition is entirely based on the notion that you can't take over the world through your own sheer spiritual power, that you objectively have zero idea of the full potential of, and that some hijacked science or its mockery told you does not exist by definition, even if we don't even know what it is. We just know that we are alive and that we don't even know what it is. So shouldn't we do anything about this? We don't need to fix categoristically definitions in order to believe things. it takes just to do them. If you've never tried, if you've never learned how to embrace suffering in order to achieve a result, well, you're in a very serious situation, a very bad one, right? And looking at history actually is a very good way to to become aware of what we're talking about. And again, not making the childish mistake, as often my mentor said, of considering yourself more intelligent or more capable of a 7th century Bulgar horseman, right? Because you aren't, but chances are in the sense that you never will. And you see, my role as Schwerpunkt is in many ways is being the harsher guy that tells you that challenges you into something, rather than simply flattering your own weakness and making you think that it's normal that you are you, or it's a good thing, or that you should never change. It's important to be yourself, as if being oneself, humanly speaking, was a normal thing. It was something to be, proud of, just in absolute terms, that you shouldn't fix, or that, if anything, just because you are going to feel the pain when you die, it's not it's something you can avoid. And so you may want to investigate on why that is the case. It's that harsh as it sounds. Like, why, when you enter it, you can't get out of it. Once you get the deal, right, you are condemned in a way. You already are, right? You're just here in a condition that is worse for you, because it's gonna get worse even if you don't understand what the hell it is. When you woke up, you're going to feel a lot of pain, but it's gonna be better later, which doesn't mean that problem solved at all, right? Nobody knows how to do it yet, but we try, and this is the entire purpose of Western civilization, of civilization in general, as the world tried, right? And there are different stages, and I think, as you know, that Western civilization, even within its own internal dialectic, so the ones that I can have, again, very pleasantly with an American follower that I deeply respect and esteem, because he's a guy that really wrote certain pieces of, like, there is a letter that he sent me, like, about the Anglo-Saxon liberty and, will to fight it, and it's similar. That I would like actually to read it. I don't know if he gives me permission. Normally, I already made, again, a couple of videos that derive from things he wrote, that I asked for using, and I read it out loud, and dispatched it for mine. And so I think that our work also derives from this, from the capacity of listening to one another, to understand, to have different ideas, or to have the same ideas, really, but just being able to discuss them, to bring our own side of the story to the plate of reality and the truth that unfortunately too often escapes our poor cognitive means, but is only one, right? So if somebody has an idea and another, you can't immediately say that one is better than the other. Then which one it is, it's another thing, but that's automatically true. And there are people, believe me, that are completely phobic to this, that are trying to subvert the entire order and saying, this is not true, this is not real. Like the aforementioned people, communists, moral relativists, those who think that they are better than, but they are absolutely hysterically and paranoidly avoiding to spread any of this traditional spiritual awareness. That's the reason why it's been erased from your school books. That's why you don't hear science talking about it much. That's why somebody hijacked this all, because they are scared of standards. They're scared of suffering. They're cowards, right? And they want to make you feel that you're okay just the way you are, so that you can die faster without leaving any trace behind. In your nothingness, instead of finding a place in the firmament because of your deeds, right? So this is also for those who like I didn't address too much. Like I wanted to talk more about. I didn't imagine the video would go like this. I wanted to talk more about this latter question, going back more to the point of the Napoleonic and the Roman and the Anglo-Saxon stuff, common law and civil law. But I couldn't find the comment, so that's why it ended up like this. I'm running out of words, voice. So I stop it here. I'm open, of course, to any questions. Should have said at the beginning if you want to ask. Like I'm always here. I'm not going to make many of these, but there are chances I'm going to look at your questions anyway, and so I'm going to gradually respond, at least in the rest of the content, right? For the more attentive user, but sometimes also in videos like these. For today, however, stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.